Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event that marks 5 years of the Syrian conflict. I want to welcome everyone in the room, but also we have a very rich audience online, and I'm delighted that we are joined by so many colleagues. The event obviously marks the 5th anniversary of the Syrian conflict. I just thought I would give some of the statistics. I'm sure you're all familiar with the numbers, but the numbers are so troubling, so powerful that I think I would just repeat some of them as we go into the discussion. We actually don't really know how many people have been killed. The statistics on the number of people dead in the conflict vary from 270,000, that's where the UN stopped counting in 2014, to 470,000. There is no reliable way of finding out how many people have actually died in the conflict so far. But we know that there are almost 14 million people in need, of which about 5 million are in hard-to-reach areas and 500,000 in besieged areas. One statistic that haunts me, actually, is that since 2011, an average of 50 Syrian families have been displaced every hour of every day. Just think about it. Every hour of every day, there are 50 families in Syria that need to move from their homes. And that means that we have almost 5 million refugees, 4.8, and 11 million displaced Syrians. 3 million Syrian children are out of school. They have no access to education. And they haven't had access to education for years now. And 3 out of 4 Syrians live in poverty. This was once a middle-income country. This is a place where now more than 10 million people need access to livelihood opportunities, to jobs, to a way of, make things do. Many of them are young people. They live in towns. It's an urban crisis above anything. And of course, refugees. And often forgotten, there are 450,000 Palestinian refugees. 250,000 of them are internally displaced, but they are some of those, really hard hit by the conflict, and we'll talk about them as well today. So in 5 years of conflict, we've seen some incredible human suffering. But 5 years is a long time, and 5 years to continue to think and address, the needs of people through emergency aid. It's a very, it's a very, very long time. But is long-term development possible in a place like Syria? Can people start to rebuild their society in the middle of a civil war? And is enough been done to actually help people survive over the long term? Can aid agencies do anything in that respect? That's what we're going to discuss today. We thought that 5 years on into the Syrian crisis, it was time to think about what can be done to help people rebuild their lives little by little so that they can, see a future for themselves and their children. And to discuss these rather difficult questions, I have an exceptional panel today. I'm really delighted to introduce, first of all, joining us from Kathmandu, Nigel Fisher. Good afternoon, Nigel. Nigel, can you hear us?
I can hear you very well.
Excellent. So Nigel is the former UN Assistant Secretary General and Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for the Syria crisis. Nigel has a very long and illustrious career with the UN, including having served as the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General in Haiti with the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operation. He's the President and the CEO of UNICEF Canada, and he's held many other senior appointments, including being the Assistant Secretary General and the Deputy Special Representative of the UN Secretary General in Afghanistan. To my right, I'm joined by Rana Khalaf, who is the Academy Asfari Senior Fellow at Chatham House and also a Research Fellow with the Center for Syrian Studies at the University of St. Andrews. Rana is a Syrian researcher, and her work focuses on civil society, on youth, and governance during conflict. And I urge you to read one of her publications, which is Beyond Arms and Beers, Local Governance over ISIS in Syria, because it's a really gripping read. And further to my right is John Bennett. John is an independent consultant, but he is also the evaluator of the Tamkeen program in Syria, which is a program that focuses on service delivery and good governance in Syria. John has 35 years of experience, sorry, you do, working in Africa, in Asia, in very many capacities as field director, country representative, team leaders for a variety of organizations, both UN and NGOs, including UNDP, World Food Programme, Norwegian Refugee Council, and Oxfam. And to my left, I have Wessam Sabane, who is the director of the Jafra Foundation for Relief and Youth Development. This is a community-based organization that is really focused on supporting Palestinians and Syrians in Palestinian refugee camps in Syria and in besieged areas such as Yarmouk camp, that I'm sure you've all heard about. So a really rich, incredible, experienced panel to discuss these issues today. Let me remind the audience, both here and online, that we'll be taking questions afterwards. So if you have questions that arise during the discussion, hold them. We'll have a Q&A session at the end. The event hashtag, for those of you who are on Twitter, is Syria 5 years, years spelled YRS. So please do turn your phone on silent, but do tweet if you are inclined to do so. And with that, let's start with Nigel, if we can. So Nigel, obviously you were the regional humanitarian coordinator. You've led, the response to the crisis until not long ago, until a year and a half ago. Was during your time recovery, livelihoods, any type of longer-term programming a possibility at all? And how much was it prioritized in the work of the UN response and that of others?
Well, thanks, and good to be with you all from Kathmandu. I'm not here on holiday. I'm working with the National Reconstruction Authority to try and help it finally get reconstruction really underway after a long delay. Anyway, yes, recovery livelihoods possible and a priority. I would say for Syria and in the refugee hosting countries, very much a possibility, a priority, I would say, fitfully at best. And can you hear me? Okay.
Very well.
Okay, good. Let me just say to begin with, I'm convinced that whatever you like to call it, whether it's resilience building, development, recovery, is possible in the midst of most crisis situations, if not all. And that includes amidst conflict, and it includes Syria too. I think a few international organizations, INGOs especially, are already increasing cash assistance. WFP is expanding its use of credit cards for affected people, especially refugees. And I think that's a huge development with very positive implications for enabling local organizations in conflict and other crises to functions with greater independence and impact. But I just want to give you two examples, two quick initiatives in which I was directly involved to start off with. First was in opposition-held northern Syria. I was based in Jordan, but I spent a great deal of my time in southern Turkey, in the Gaziantep Hatay area. And from early on in my tenure, I met a steady stream of Syrians coming from inside Syria, Aleppo especially, Idlib, Homs, other cities and rural areas, representatives of, they could be local councils, civil society organizations, the private sector, as well as diaspora organizations. They had a common lament, and that was their inability to access donor funds directly themselves to address the requirements in their communities according to priorities that they themselves defined, whether it was to keep hospitals going, electrifying basic services, schools open, water supply running, flour mills, all critical services to help the local population, which could also create employment and perhaps reduce the exodus from their communities. For the most part, if they could get access to funding at all, they had to be, at best, subcontractors of international organizations, INGOs, and to some extent UN organizations, which frankly limited their ability to focus on their own defined priorities. So I initiated two things, one through my team in Gaziantep, several of whom were in and out of Syria all the time, but very much under the radar, as no cross-border UN activity was authorized by the Security Council until July 2014. And this was to help Syrian organizations set up, first of all, their own association or coordinating body, even though some of them participated in both the INGO and the UN coordination meetings. That then became a counterpart for an interesting initiative, I brought in a consulting group that I'd worked with before, and they're called Building Markets. And that was to see how we could, I guess you'd call it, validate Syrian organizations, especially in the face of donors, to see, to confirm that they were bona fide, functioned well administratively and financially, and could deliver the humanitarian aid or services they claimed to deliver. And we met with donors to clarify their particular concerns and address how to deal, for example, with anti-terrorism legislation issues and to address risk issues. So we came up with a system, and this was really in the April, May, June, July period, 2014. We came up with a system of validation which could reassure, especially donors to some extent. And at that stage, Valerie Amos, who was then ERC, agreed that OCHA would set up a pooled fund which could direct funds to Syrian organizations. OCHA was supposed to be able to manage that and absorb some of the risk, and we started to canvass interested donors, and several were interested. Of course, the spanner in the works was at that point my appointment came to an end, and I left it to others to follow through. I left in August 2014, so I'm already pretty out of date. And I don't know how far that went. But I think the experience indicates that supporting local actors, whether directly for delivery of humanitarian assistance or to help keep services going, is possible. And you can assure donors in terms of some of the risk factors. So I would say this frustration of local actors that they would like to be able to work directly themselves on their own priorities is something we need to look at and see how we can support them. A second example, on a regional level, I led an exercise to develop what was called a comprehensive regional strategic framework, quite a mouthful. And that was looking at immediate humanitarian priorities in Syria and the refugee hosting countries. But it was also looking at resilience issues, and on the assumption that the conflict would continue, how could you start to look much better at what you might call development or recovery issues? But primarily, how do you support local actors who work in such situations? This involved a whole host of actors, humanitarian, those more focused traditionally on recovery, international and local actors, host governments, donors, financial institutions. Some of it was focused on Syria, but a great majority on refugee hosting communities. And there was an issue too, I'm sure, as many of you know, that communities in Jordan and Lebanon especially hosting refugees found themselves in competition between hosts and refugees for social services, rental accommodation, jobs, and this was increasing social tensions. I would say this focus of helping host communities too in a more sort of resilience community development-oriented way, it's in the current regional appeal, but frankly seriously underfunded. And I also think that that kind of activity is too narrowly pushed into a resilience or recovery budget category. And as you know, it's been poorly funded. But I do think humanitarian actors can do also much more to work with and support local civil society actors and municipalities in refugee hosting countries. Some of you may know the approach tried in Zatari camp in Jordan by UNHCR collaborating with a couple of municipal authorities from California, it might have been Los Angeles, I think, and Holland, to train Syrian refugees to run Zatari like a municipality. I think that's a great initiative, great experience for if and when Syrians can return home and have to reestablish local governments and community structures at home. More generally, I'm convinced that when central governments fail or have little or no credibility with citizens, as in Syria or Iraq, then I think working with and through residual local authorities serves two purposes. You can maintain community services, and I think there are lots of local councils in Syria still functioning despite the hell there, but it also strengthens the credibility of local government institutions for citizens when central government structures fail. And I'm almost finished. I think our humanitarian system in general is increasingly outmoded. It's still largely top-down. It's still largely externally driven. And I think there's growing demand in the global south by affected people and local actors for greater autonomy in determining their survival, resilience, and recovery strategies. And I think we ignore this impatience, we ignore these demands at our peril. I think we internationals must, wherever and whenever possible, see ourselves increasingly in a supporting and accompanying role and decreasingly in the so-called driving seat. Sorry, that was quite a mouthful to start with, but I'll stop there.
That's great. Thanks, Naja. No, and we'll come to the support to local government and local councils in a second. But I want to ask Wissam to reflect on, some of the things, some of the issues you have posed that are really at the heart of some of the, if you want, the tensions of, how the aid organizations have been responding in the Syrian crisis and more globally. I mean, Wissam, you lead a local organization. I mean, can you offer your reflections of what Najal has said in terms of the kind of work you are engaged with, how you could sort of use, if you want, funding to work on some of the livelihoods issues of the kind of employment, support work that you do, but also give us a flavor of actually what the livelihoods opportunities that still exist in Syria, how businesses operate, how various industries operate, how you engage with them, and so how aid could be different, and what you do around that.
Thank you. Maybe I can start by explaining a little bit the situation on the ground regarding the economical situation and livelihood conditions on Syria. So after 5 years of this conflict, the Syria's economical situation have changed a lot. So mainly you have many indicators that can show you this change. The inflation of the Syrian pound. Normally, before the war, the average salary was around $500 in Syria, which is 25,000 Syrian pound. Now $100 is equal to 40. Yesterday was 43,000 Syrian pound. Salaries are still the same in Syria, so the average of salaries now in the government or in the opposition is around 30,000 Syrian pound, which is equal now to $70 US dollar. This shows you how much people are now, the quality of life and the conditions of life inside Syria have changed. Most of the people now is depending on the aid, which was not normal in Syria. We never heard about anybody in Syria was receiving a food basket except the Palestinian refugees in Syria. So now most of the families in Syria and people in Syria is depending on this aid, in kind of cash distribution or food distribution or hygiene kits. And I speak about the two areas, regime control area or government control area and opposition controlled area. Most of this aid now is being controlled or run by two different actors, which is one of them is the UN agencies that has regular distributions. Mostly it was in the government control area. Now, newly we begin to see more UN access on the besieged area or opposition controlled area. And then the local communities, local organizations in the opposition control area, but also somehow in government control area with the coordination of UN and ICRC and the Red Crescent. Most of the economy situation, biggest factories in Syria that was producing the main materials for the market in Syria, or have been destroyed or have stopped because of lack of materials that was mainly exported from outside Syria. Most of the big businesses that was functioning in Syria have also stopped, and the economy has turned down to small businesses and small groups who is trying to cover the market, which with different materials and with different qualities also. Also economical embargo on Syria have affected a lot on the market inside the areas, especially government control area and besieged area, which is also connected to the economy of the regime control area and others. Most of the qualified people who was, for example, they speak about now there is 10% of doctors who left in Syria. Originally, I don't remember the number, but 90% of doctors, 90% of professors, trainers, education staff have immigrated outside the country. Also, around 70% of the education system have collapsed in Syria because now, for example, universities who try to educate people to go to run businesses or to run the economy is depending on low qualified people to do the education for the students. Besides the economy of war, and this is a long story that now we have seen now an emerge of a new businesses, an emerge of a new people and key people in all the sides that is depending on the economy of war. And that means like there is now special key people who can deal with relief market. There is special people and already like exclusive people who can deal with access and who can deal with purchasing or selling on the market. Mainly now we also begin to see new chances for new markets in Syria. In fact, this was like since many years as a local NGO, we were asking, we don't want to depend and let our beneficiary or our people depend on food basket. Let's begin to think about something new. Let's begin to think how, for example, we can activate the community itself to produce what they need, not depend on us or depend on the humanitarian aid. Many areas in Syria, I can speak about little examples. For example, in some besieged area until now we are dealing with water trucking. While if we calculate how much money we put in water trucking and how much money we needed since the beginning to repair and reactivate the infrastructure to do the water itself, it was like big differences. Still until now the donors and the big donor or the international community is fighting not to go on livelihood and stability. There is money concerns. One of them who can we, because the first cost to do stabilized projects is a little bit more expensive than to do a relief project. But in the long term, if you want to calculate in the long term, it's much more cheap. But everybody is telling that still we are in war. We cannot guarantee that this tank of water, this infrastructure can function for a long time. And who will run this infrastructure? This is the main issue that was faced for us as a local NGO. To defy the economy of war and to defy the key holder of this economy. Unfortunately, this economy of war is not only depending on inside Syria, but it's also begin to have exclusivity outside Syria that is connected with the people inside Syria, which make it more difficult for us to go on livelihood or on stabilizing the economy on the areas where we are working. Many areas inside Syria was a little bit localized, successful to do this kind of stabilized work. For example, the agriculture. Many areas inside Syria who succeeded to continue with agriculture in their areas succeeded also to have stabilization. And we speak about political stabilization, even if they are opposition-controlled area or regime-controlled area, they kept the economical relation between the two areas because of the common interest between the two areas. For example, inside Syria, there is a big need for vegetables. Inside Damascus, in government-controlled area, there is many lack of vegetables, or flour, any kind of agricultural materials that is needed on the market. There is many areas now who succeeded to continue these agricultural projects and to sell to the regime control area, and in regard they could have some benefits of access, of exchange of materials and fuel and other. And this is what the local NGOs or the local community was since the beginning of the conflict asking for. Now there's a big intention to go and work on stabilization from the donor and the international community. So we see a big chance to encourage this. the medium-sized businesses begin to think about what to do inside Syria and what kind of market is available in Syria. Reconstruction also begin, many companies also now begin to think about reconstruction and how to begin to work in Syria, and even the local actors, the local businessmen begin also to reconstruct themselves and look for partners with other businessmen from outside and other experience. In general, this is the situation. Everybody now begin to think about the future in Syria, and this is why we see what I think I call it a ceasefire in our mind. On the ground, there is no real ceasefire. What is happening is local ceasefires because of economy and because of mutual interest between the two sides, and because everybody is tired also.
Very interesting. So, I mean, it sounds like on the library side, obviously, it's been a struggle to, initiate or really push forward some of these projects earlier on, during the crisis. But on the governance side, we've seen investment instead, earlier on. I mean, John, you've been evaluating Tamkeen, which is a program that is focused on governance. I mean, granted, also on service delivery, but has been working on trying to put some of the governance infrastructure on the ground, right in the height of the conflict. So can you tell us a little bit about, what Tamkeen is all about, but also how it works, how it's been working in the height of the conflict?
Yeah. First of all, I should say that I don't work for Tamkeen. I'm an independent evaluator, and we were commissioned actually by DFID to go and conduct an independent evaluation of Tamkeen. So I'm not here to defend Tamkeen. I'm merely pointing out that right from the outset. It's true that I should first of all also, for those of you who don't know, just explain very briefly what Tamkeen is. The idea is to introduce good governance practices in opposition-held Syria. And by doing this, what the British government, and with also some money from the EU, have done is to introduce what they call Tamkeen committees, which have a certain budget over a period of 6 months or so, which they can spend on basic services. And they choose how to spend that budget. They create a committee at a local level, and then the Tamkeen program actually is supposed to demonstrate through these projects, demonstrate how good governance may or may not be acceptable to the local population. So the idea really is to introduce governance by way of example, if you like, and the example being through the Tamkeen process. That's how it was initiated. Inevitably, in some of these areas, the projects themselves become more important than the process. That's one thing we unsurprisingly found in the evaluation, because I think, and this goes back in a sense to something that Nigel was saying, but also Wassam, and that's that there is probably a grey area that lies between humanitarian and development. And in the case of providing basic services to civilians in situations like this, the definition or the distinction between humanitarian and development is probably not there. That's the first thing to say. So it becomes very important that when you provide even a minimum amount of funding for basic services, those services become absolutely essential. The second thing is that what we did with this evaluation, and most importantly what we did, was not just look at those civilian structures, but we also looked at the context in which they were placed. We did a conflict analysis of the vicinity, and we looked at how local councils reacted with the Tamkeen process, and whether it might be possible in the medium term to transition from having this rather artificial thing called Tamkeen and perhaps integrate it within the local council structure, which is increasingly taking place, by the way. And so we were asking those questions around what was the community's opinion about the Tamkeen process. Did they see any improvements in governance at the local level? And did they think that transparency and accountability and all those usual things that we're trying to promote, did they consider those to be important? That was another question. As far as the context is concerned, one thing we noted was that over the last 2 years, there's been quite a significant shift from military bodies being in control to civilian bodies being in control. The reason for this is that military bodies were actually pretty bad at delivering basic services to the community. So when there was the opportunity, when the opportunity arose for outside donors to fund civilian bodies, this was not only acceptable to the local population, but it was also, surprisingly, acceptable to some of the military groups as well, who were only too happy to hand over that responsibility. However, having done that, they also retained quite a lot of influence on some of the councils, and in particular have retained influence on the judicial processes. But at the same time, there's been quite a shift, as you know, in some of these areas between who's in control militarily and who's not. And so there's been this gradual and certainly discernible difference, if you like, between the civilian and the military approaches. That was the first thing we noted. The second thing we noted was that conflicts in these areas, for the most part, are localized conflicts. What has happened is that once having taken the lid off this top-down type of control from the regime, what then happened, and is happening, is a large number of very small conflicts between families, between clans, whatever. They've all come to the surface, and they are the main impediment to introducing good governance in some of these areas, because these local groups, families, clans, whatever you want to call them, they are contesting among each other over power. And it's a sort of shifting, very volatile, in some cases, situation. So rather than dealing with the macro war, it's the micro wars that are really making a difference on the ground. So it's therefore even more important that something like Tamkeen is demonstrably accountable to a public who then increase their demand for those services. And that's really what we were looking for. We were looking for whether or not the local population had in fact increased, had demanded greater transparency. It varied very much from area to area, the answer to the question. We found that in the more stable areas, and there are some stable areas in Syria, the more stable areas, it was easier to entrench that idea of good governance. In the less stable areas, there was still that mentality that everything is very, very temporary. Everything is, we're not going to look beyond next month. So therefore, why would we be concerned about setting up some kind of permanent local council structure if really all we need is just supplies? So it depended very much, and there was quite a variance in what we looked at between those areas that had been established, along quite a while back, and those that have only recently been established. So that was another key finding. If we were to go into the issue of good governance, which was the primary purpose of this, I think there are lots and lots of issues around the political economy of war, which Wassam was mentioning. Inevitably, if you're going to do projects in these areas, as soon as you introduce a project, you need supplies. Those supplies might be fuel, in many cases, or they might be basic supplies like food. But fuel, of course, being a primary supply issue. As soon as you start looking at the political economy, who's in charge of these supplies, you get into embarrassing situations where a project that's funded by the British government and the EU does necessarily depend on the war economy for its survival. And the supply of fuel comes through intermediaries, but nevertheless everybody knows that it comes from ISIS-controlled areas. So there are compromises here. There are compromises that are necessary just by virtue of the way in which the economy is set up. There are also issues around who controls some of these resources in terms of the families and individuals. One of the positive things that's come out of Tamkeen is that it's kept, to some degree, kept the prices down that would by providing a public service, because what was happening was there was increasingly a privatization of services, and consequently people were having to pay for fairly high prices for basic services. Once having introduced the idea of a local council that's functioning, then it at least created some kind of positive influence on prices. The downside of it has been, however, that in the history of the local governance in these areas, it used to be a very top-down system. It's now a bottom-up system, but it depends on the capacity of the individuals who are running it. Many of the professionals, as Wessam said, many of the professionals have left the country, including those who used to run some of the local councils. So the local councils, in many places, tend to be people who don't necessarily have experience. And it's that capacity issue which is impairing some of the smooth running of council services. We looked at the age range of people who are involved in this, and we found, for instance, in some areas, the average age of somebody who was a member of a council was about around 28, around that age, and which is a very low age for, and of course, inevitably, there are capacity issues here. And so, did Tamkeen set up a parallel structure? Yes, it did, but it did so purposely to offset some of those deficiencies in the local council. Is Tamkeen moving increasingly towards working with the local council? Yes, it is, by having members of the local council involved in the Tamkeen process and vice versa. And in fact, the next stage of the Tamkeen program is going to be increasingly working with local councils and through local councils. And we're doing a needs assessment around that at the moment. So there has been historically a sort of shift, if you like, towards much more of a civilian, a normal, if you like, council structure. But in order to get there, it was arguably necessary to have created this rather artificial thing called Tamkeen as a first step towards that. I'll stop there and then we'll go into that.
Thanks. Yes, I'm sure you can then, actually, I'm sure Rana has got a few observations on that, because you've been criticizing in your last paper, taken exceptions with good governance programming in Syria. Tell us why. What are the key issues? I mean, John has already elicited, a few doubts around, the challenges that inevitably come with this kind of programming. But I know that you have some specific views on some of the good governance programming in Syria.
So, Sarah, I'll go to the basics of program design and assessment and ask about good governance, the what, the why, and the how. So what is good governance really? And is it good to start with, and good according to who? So, so when starting with this, and I'm not speaking about the locals' perspective, I'm speaking about the World Bank, the UN, DFID, implementers, INGOs, and okay, there are those notions about transparency, accountability, but we realize there's no one common understanding of what good governance is. So imagine with me this going on in the ground in a context like Syria, what happens is every side would apply their own understanding of what a good governance means. And we don't only have Tamkeen on the ground in Syria. When we're speaking about, we were just speaking about this privatization of aid, let's say, to Syria, or support to Syria, where we have private implementers, government subcontracted implementers operating usually from Gaziantep, those very big, very well resourced private agencies, and they're the ones who are in specific working on good governance inside Syria, and they're not only British, they're American, they belong to different governments. Even Gulf countries have been involved in this. And we look at other, because again, Nigel, you've highlighted that the aid industry and the development are so intertwined. INGOs are part of this too. And then we have the locals. So just looking at it, look at the coordination problem in terms of local governance, each side trying to implement their own vision of local governance. So that's one issue. Now, the second issue, if I will go to the second question about good governance, how are these good governance programs implemented on the ground on Syria? And, you know, the old new debate about them being top down or bottom up, yes, they are still top down. And when we're talking about projects conceived, designed, and assessed by externals, of course they are top down. Even when those big organizations say that 80% of our staff are Syrians, and then I ask them, so is any of the decision makers Syrian? No. Basically what's happening is this outsourcing of services to the locals on the ground. It's not necessarily always negative. There are pros and cons to the situation and why this is happening. Okay, capacity can be one idea, but there are certainly different problems to this. But the other problem is this technocratic approach that doesn't look into the context on the ground in Syria. So I hear a lot of this debate about 5 years of war in Syria. When Syrians hear it, a lot of the people, at least in the opposition-held areas, they will say, no, it's it started as an uprising and a peaceful one. So for them, it's not 5 years of war. The following years were war. And I see it as a Syria, researcher. I see it as a different layers of everything going together. So the approach here is different because we don't really have just an internal conflict. We have some kind of a layer of a revolution happening where the young, people who revolted about governance was a problem. And that's at the beginning of the uprising, we remember people calling for governance changes. So that was a key problem. And this gives us a little bit of insight into the agency of these people. But if we look at how implementers are implementing governance, so they look into corruption, for instance, or participation. And suddenly participation is, it's 1, 2, 3, about decisions, about deadlines. If the locals apply this, check, participation is happening. Never do we ask why are some people not participating. Corruption is usually about bookkeeping. So if you hold the financials correct and, if people are, elected, this one-off events. So practically we dealt with corruption, but little attention is paid to this war economy on the ground, why actually people deal with certain people. Little attention is paid on the legitimacy factor on the ground. Why is corruption, why do people deal with certain peoples? Those, micro conflicts that you spoke about. So there's another layer into how to deal with them beyond, the copy paste. It worked in Africa, let's carry it and put it in Syria, it might work. So that's part of the problem with with the how. And then I go to the third question of why. So why are we implementing good governance programs in Syria to start with? Peace building, state building. But what are we really talking about here? Peace building for who, really? And more often than not, I use these 3 pillars in my paper: security, effectiveness, and legitimacy. When we're talking about peace building, it's usually looked upon as international security, security from terrorist attack to the international, security from the migration from the refugee crisis, and little attention is paid to actually the security of the locals on the ground. And it's not either or. I speak about this hybrid governance where this is important, but this is important too to solve that problem. So maybe we need to look at security the way ISIS looks at it, for instance, where the minute, I know you would be laughing at it, but what ISIS does, the minute it controls an area, it stops looting because practically it kills everybody else, but it stops looting. And at the beginning of the uprisings, the areas where ISIS used to attack and invade, the regime rarely shelled these areas. So at some point when I'm Skyping with people in Deir ez-Zor before ISIS moved in, they were like, it doesn't matter. We already had al-Nusra, now ISIS is coming. And at least we will not be shelled by the regime if ISIS comes. And that was the attitude. And the army there did not side with anybody. And to them, both were worse than each other. And hey, we have some kind of security. So that's, maybe we need to look at that from a local lens. And let's move on to the second pillar that I speak about, effectiveness. Effectiveness is not just about implementing projects, and it's exactly what you said, John, about the Tamkeen, focusing on the Tamkeen project, not the process. It's people have been asking, for instance, not to stop those food baskets, the fertilizers, livelihoods, and it's been some time they've been asking about this. But no, the insistence, let's just keep on bringing in food baskets. Some of them have been asking for cash. I know this is very debatable, but they were, their reasoning is we were mobilize an entire economy inside those areas rather than, $200 in Turkey might buy us, that much, in Syria it would buy that much. So that was the difference. And then we go to that very important aspect, legitimacy. Legitimacy on the ground is not just this legal type of legitimacy seen in Western part. It's legitimacy based on blood ties, legitimacy based on relationships. Trust is a very important factor. Those things are not things we can, just write on paper and send in a beautiful proposal, but they're very important to a project if it will succeed or not. And when we have such projects happening on the ground, the locals need to trust the internationals that, yes, you will abide by what you say and you are actually transparent and accountable to us. Never did I see any of those big implementers actually highlighting the kind of work they're doing in Syria. So are they actually accountable to the locals, or are they just accountable to their funders and donors? So maybe we need to look into that. And just then, we may be able to understand, how the locals see it, that, those social movements, those demonstrations still happening now with the truce, ceasefire, whatever you may call it, it just means something. People did want change, and they still want change. Just the fact that we want security, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have to come with a real change at the social, economic, and cultural level. And when we're speaking about peace, peace needs to come with justice. And rarely do I hear anybody speaking about justice in the, international circles. So.
Thank you so much, Rana. I just want to go back to Nigel before I open up to the, to the questions from the floor, because all of you have highlighted and stressed the importance of this local lens in everything we do, whether it is emergency aid or engagement in the longer term development assistance, whether it is about creating jobs or governance. And if anything, it's also to better understand the political economy of the war and who you're dealing with and how the local lens inevitably is the only one that can really guide this understanding. And this is not a new thing. I mean, over the last 5 years of the conflict in Syria, there has been a lot of discussion about really, making sure that this, the response can be locally driven. I mean, in my own team, we've done quite a lot of work on that. And yet, Nigel, we don't see this change, not at the level required. I mean, we see quite a bit of lip service to it and rhetoric and a little bit of tinkering here and there, but ultimately this mindset shift about really ceding the power and allowing local organizations, local sort of structures to lead the response is not happening. What do we need to do to really make sure that this paradigm shift does take place?
Before I get to that, can I just dip my toe back into governance? Because I think it's been very interesting what has been said so far. And this issue of what is good governance, what is legitimacy, what is justice. I look at this because I've been involved with several UN peacekeeping missions, and I think UN political and peacekeeping missions tend to look at national institutions, and above all, they tend to look at elections as somehow leading to democracy. I think they may be on the wrong track. And for example, I would argue that delivery of basic services to citizens might be a much better indicator of good governance. If I can just then sidetrack to Haiti, we did a nationwide study on what local people, peasants, thought what is democracy. And I'll tell you what they came up with. Several indicators: 2 meals a day instead of 1, good health, sleeping on a mattress instead of on the floor, and living in a community where those who have more help those with less. I didn't hear much about elections there. So I think it might be interesting to ask Syrians similarly, how would they define an effective and good governance? Anyway, that's that. Back to the issue of the longer term programming, livelihood supporting local actors. I do, as I said before, I think there's much more that can be done to scale up. Why isn't it happening? Of course, it's difficult. It's high risk. It's really challenging logistically. But I would say for international actors, well, that's why we're there. If there weren't any problems, we wouldn't be there. That's our bread and butter. So I'd say that aside from the practical and logistical difficulties, there are some underlying factors, and they relate to what you call a mindset shift, where I think international actors have to do much more reflection on how they think and act. I would say a huge problem is the lack of knowledge on the part of arriving international humanitarians of local actors and their capacities. You can link this back to the limitations or the lack of crisis preparedness, risk and vulnerability analysis. And if this is one area where humanitarians and so-called development actors need to work together, it's there. I think there has to be much better prior local knowledge in crisis situations. And I think that local knowledge includes identification of local actors and their capacities. And I would say there's a lack of experience or a lack of comfort level on the part of actors, international actors working in crisis, especially humanitarian actors, in really collaborating as equals with actors, whether from the crisis situation or from even actors in the wider region in which the crisis situation is unfolding. That lack of preparedness, lack of knowledge. I think the other related to that is a lack of experience in seeing how local actors can maintain their capacities or recover their service delivery and employment capacities after suffering losses. I think we need to start thinking, how can we help local private sector, local community organizations, for example, recapitalize or get refinanced after they lost their capital and they lost their collateral. That demands the kind of financing mechanisms that don't exist, or if they exist in country, they exist with local interest rates of 20%. They're impossible. So I think that combination of lack of preparedness, lack of knowledge, lack of experience in seeing how to work with local actors is key. I think we have to recognize the well-established tradition of external humanitarian intervention, which is with its heavy emphasis on direct provision of humanitarian aid and much less on supporting local and reinforcing local actors and infrastructure. I know I'm painting everything with a broad brush, but I want to be quick. I saw in the Syria crisis, but elsewhere, narrow and protective mandate definitions. That's a real sickness, very much in the UN, which I was part for a long time, and the related concerns about protection of mandate, protection of budget, which I would say limits creative, innovative, and cooperative behavior. I think there's much more need for innovative thinking. So just to summarize again, I think capable local organizations always exist. Look beyond Syria to Congo, where we've had decades of conflict. What organizations have been keeping schools going, health centers open, community outreach services, pharmacies, centers for trauma recovery or reintegration of girls who've been raped or boys who've been made into child soldiers? It's local women's organizations, it's local church groups and community groups and so on. We need to be able to know how to work with them much better. And if I can make one last general statement, what do people in Syria and frankly other complex crises ask for? I have 30 years of experience in this kind of work. And I think there's consistency across crises and across continents. People obviously have survival needs and they know it. But if you ask them what they want, most of all, they say two things. I found this consistently. Jobs, because having a job and getting paid gives you autonomy, it gives you choice, and it gives you dignity that you don't get getting handouts. And the second is education for their children, because it's a path to the future. We hear those. How often do we really respond to these fundamental, consistent felt needs? And so I repeat what I said before. We have to know our environments much better, know who the local actors are, support their capacities, and move aside where necessary.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. And the times I've heard jobs and education in every crisis I've worked in, even in the, the deepest moment of crisis and the heights of the war, is countless. Let's open to the Q&A, to the questions from the floor. Let's start with the people in the room. Can you please say your name and if you have an institutional affiliation, who you are affiliated with when you take the floor?